In the year 66 CE, a spark of rebellion in a small Roman province ignited a war that would shake the ancient world. Judea, worn down by decades of heavy taxation, religious friction, and corrupt governance, rose up against the might of Rome. What began as isolated protests exploded into a full-scale revolt, and Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of the Jewish people, became the stage for one of history's most brutal sieges. Roman rule over the province had never been comfortable. Governors sent from Rome often showed little regard for local customs or religious sensitivities, and taxation drained the population while enriching distant elites far from Judea's hills. Tensions simmered for years, fueled by incidents of desecration, unfair judgments, and outright provocation by Roman officials stationed in the region. Radical factions emerged, most notably the Zealots, who believed armed resistance was the only path to freedom. Their message found fertile ground among a population exhausted by humiliation and years of quiet resentment. When the Roman procurator Gessius Florus seized funds from the temple treasury in Jerusalem, the fragile peace shattered completely and irreversibly. Riots broke out in the streets, Roman soldiers were attacked, and the garrison stationed in the city was overwhelmed by the sudden fury. Emboldened rebels then destroyed a Roman military column sent to restore order, an act that made compromise nearly impossible for either side. News of the uprising reached Rome, and the Emperor Nero, unwilling to tolerate open defiance, ordered a full military response against the province. Across Judea, the revolt spread with startling speed, as towns and villages that had long resented Roman taxation and interference joined the cause almost overnight. Local councils that might once have urged caution found themselves swept aside by younger, more militant voices demanding immediate action. Weapons were seized from Roman armories, fortifications were hastily reinforced, and makeshift militias formed in cities across the region, each convinced that sheer determination could offset Rome's superior numbers and equipment. For a brief, heady moment, it seemed as though the rebellion might actually succeed, especially after early skirmishes went in the rebels' favor and Roman forces were forced into embarrassing retreats. That early optimism, however, would prove dangerously short-lived once the full weight of imperial power was finally set into motion. Command of the campaign fell to Vespasian, a seasoned general with decades of battlefield experience, aided by his capable son Titus. Their strategy was methodical. Rather than striking directly at Jerusalem, they moved first to crush resistance across the Judean countryside, isolating the capital and cutting off any hope of reinforcement or escape from outside forces. Town after town fell under the weight of Roman siege engines, iron discipline, and overwhelming numbers of trained legionaries. Galilee, long a stronghold of rebel activity, was subdued through brutal campaigns that left fortified towns in smoking ruins within months. Yet as Roman forces tightened their grip on the region, chaos consumed the rebel side from within its own ranks. Rival factions inside Jerusalem turned against one another, driven by mistrust and competing visions of leadership and strategy. Instead of uniting against the common enemy, armed groups fought bloody internal battles within the city walls, weakening its defenses long before Rome's legions ever reached its gates. This internal fracture proved catastrophic for the city's chances. Supplies meant to sustain a prolonged siege were destroyed amid factional infighting, and leaders capable of coordinating a unified defense were killed or pushed aside by rivals. By the time Titus led his forces to encircle Jerusalem in 70 CE, the city was already weakened from within, a fortress divided against itself, even as a far greater storm gathered just beyond its walls. Meanwhile, Vespasian's own fortunes shifted dramatically when Nero died and Rome plunged into a chaotic year marked by rapid successions of emperors. Seizing the moment, Vespasian's own troops proclaimed him emperor, and he departed for Rome to secure his throne, leaving his son Titus to finish the campaign against Judea. Titus inherited not only his father's legions, but also his methodical approach, assembling an overwhelming force of tens of thousands of soldiers, engineers, and auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire. He understood that Jerusalem's natural defenses, its steep terrain and thick walls, would demand patience, discipline, and relentless pressure rather than a single decisive strike, and he prepared his army accordingly for a long and grinding campaign ahead. The siege of Jerusalem stands among the most devastating events of the ancient world. Titus surrounded the city with massive earthworks and towers, cutting off every route for food, water, or escape. Inside the walls, starvation spread rapidly, and surviving accounts describe unimaginable suffering among trapped civilians caught between two forces. Despite the desperation, Jewish defenders fought with fierce determination, repelling repeated assaults and inflicting heavy casualties on seasoned Roman soldiers. Every district of the city became a battlefield, with fighting raging street by street and house by house. Roman engineers built massive siege ramps and battering rams to breach the outer defenses, while defenders sabotaged these structures whenever possible, delaying the inevitable through sheer resolve and ingenuity. As weeks turned into months, conditions inside Jerusalem grew catastrophic beyond description. Disease spread through the starving population, and reports from the period describe families torn apart by hunger, fear, and mounting despair. Still, the defenders held their ground with a determination rooted in religious devotion and a desperate hope for survival against impossible odds. Eventually, Roman forces broke through the outer walls, then the second line of defense, pushing the remaining fighters and terrified civilians into the temple complex itself, the final bastion of resistance in a city that refused to yield until nothing more remained to defend. Refugees who attempted to flee the city in search of food were reportedly captured in large numbers and subjected to brutal punishment meant to discourage further desertions from within the crumbling defenses. Meanwhile, those who remained trapped inside faced impossible choices between starvation and the ever-present danger of Roman assault, with some accounts describing scenes of desperation so severe that they remain difficult to comprehend even by the standards of ancient warfare. The psychological toll on both sides mounted steadily as the siege dragged on, hardening resolve among defenders, even as it fueled growing frustration among Roman commanders, eager to bring the costly campaign to its conclusion. The climax of the siege came with the destruction of the Second Temple, an event of profound and lasting significance for the Jewish people. Roman soldiers, driven by chaos and fury after months of grueling combat, set the sacred structure ablaze, reducing centuries of religious and cultural heritage to smoldering ashes. Historical accounts suggest Titus may have wished to preserve the building, but the fires of war proved impossible to contain once they were ignited. The destruction of the temple marked far more than a military victory. It symbolized the collapse of Jewish political and religious autonomy in the region. Thousands were killed in the final assault, while survivors faced enslavement or exile, scattered across the wider Roman world. Jerusalem itself was left in ruins, its walls torn down, and its population devastated beyond recognition or repair. Though the city had fallen, the war was not yet fully over. Pockets of resistance continued for several more years, most famously at the fortress of Masada, where defenders held out against Roman siege efforts until the bitter end. The broader consequences reshaped Jewish life for generations, accelerating the dispersal of communities throughout the empire and transforming religious practice in the temple's absence. For Rome, the victory was celebrated as proof of imperial dominance, commemorated through monuments and triumphant processions back in the capital. Yet the war also revealed the immense cost of suppressing determined resistance, foreshadowing further unrest that would erupt decades later. The Great Revolt remains a defining chapter in ancient history, a lasting testament to what happens when empire and identity collide with devastating force. Centuries later, historians still study the conflict as a case study in the costs of rebellion against an overwhelming power, weighing the courage of the defenders against the sheer scale of destruction that followed their defeat. The fall of Jerusalem did not erase Jewish identity or faith, but it forced a profound transformation, as religious life adapted to survive without the temple that had stood at its center for generations. Communities that scattered across the Mediterranean carried traditions, memories, and a determination to endure that would outlast the empire that had once seemed unshakable, ensuring that the story of the Great Revolt would echo far beyond the ruins of the ancient city itself.